So how do you care for your cannabis product once you've purchased it? Let's look at a few guidelines that we have here. You probably want to keep it in its original child-proof packaging. That's really important if you're traveling with your product and you want, you happen to get stopped and they want to know if that's a legally purchased product. You do run into that issue if you are have grown your own product, which is legal to do, and then you're transporting that with you, which is legal to do as long as you're under 30 grams. Or if you're in the medical system, whatever your grams per day allowance is, times 30, that's how much you can carry with you. And that there is a maximum amount on there up to 150 grams if you're in the medical system, and your authorization is 5 grams per day. So keep it in the original childproof packaging, especially if you're traveling with that. If it is a homegrown product, make sure that you have some sort of childproof packaging that you can keep that in, store that in, especially if you're traveling with it or if there's young children within the house. Make sure that everything is properly labeled. So, of course, your licensed producer product or your product from a retail store is going to have proper labeling on it. If you do have homemade products, properly label that. If it has THC in it, put a THC warning on there. Put big letters, make sure it's easy to see so that any older children will be advised caution around it if they happen to stumble across it. Roommates, you don't want your roommates getting into a homemade product that you've made that might look like a yummy brownie. And then just store it out of reach of youth and children and pets. I know some people go to the extreme of keeping their product in a safe that has a combination lock on it or in a locked cupboard. And again, depends on the situation within your household, but by all means, keep those products for sure out of reach, and even better, both out of reach and out of sight in an area where it's more difficult for children who might be getting up to some mischief might come across. So again, use the same precautions that we would use when we're storing alcohol in the house and there's children around. Maybe that, make sure that you're also warning your children about this is an adult use product. It can cause some damage in children. So, don't use it. Stay away from it. This is adult only product. You probably don't want to purchase more than about 2 to 4 months of product at a time, and that will help ensure freshness mostly. We have seen some cases of some product that is over a year old still being sold on the market. Right now, there is no best before date or expiration date on any cannabis products in Canada. I know I have kept some edible oil for about 2.5 years, and around I'd forgotten about it in the back of a cupboard, and I went to use it. It was about 2.5 years old, and it had sort of gotten a little bit rancid on there, so it was a waste of about half a bottle. So don't overstock up on your product, but you want to have enough for your own use, so you're not having to order every week as well. So again, you have to kind of weigh the pros with the cons on how much you purchase at a time. So our flower or dried herb storage, when you buy that, of course, you want that in an airtight container because it will degrade with age. A lot of the volatile oils, which are also called the terpenes that we learned about, those can sort of evaporate off if it's in an open container. So keep it airtight, and we want to keep the moisture content. That's another reason to have that in an airtight container. We want to keep it at room temperature. I know some people like to store it in the fridge or the freezer. It's not necessary. Your oils, if you use an edible oil, if you store that in the fridge, some oils will get quite viscous or even solidify at cooler temperatures. So then it makes it really hard to use your product. So keep it at room temperature is kind of best. Keep it out of sunlight, away from sources of heat, away from an open window, those kinds of things. You can get these humidity packs to go in your purchased cannabis product or your homemade cannabis products, and that's going to keep the humidity somewhere between 54 and 63%. Some people even like it a little bit more humid, maybe up to 69%, but somewhere between that 54 to 63% is going to keep your product nice and fresh. Don't do what you do with brown sugar, where you keep, a piece of bread or a slice of apple or an orange peel in the container. That works really well for keeping brown sugar products from going hard, but it will turn your cannabis product, your expensive cannabis product, it will turn it moldy. So always just use some sort of a product, humidity pack product that has been specifically designed for keeping dry cannabis at the right humidity level. And of course that only works if you're using it in a closed container that has a tight lid on it that can seal up nice and tight. If your product does dry out and it makes it harder to use in your vaporizer, your dry herb vaporizer, so the drier it is, the less of those volatile components there are to evaporate off. So you can rehydrate your product, so use your Boveda. That's probably the most reliable. There are a few competitors starting to come out of those little packs. You can buy them in packs of 10. Some licensed producers will sell them. A lot of your cannabis stores are going to sell them as well. And you can rehydrate your product to a certain extent with those packs. It can take several days to even a couple of weeks to get your product rehydrated properly, and you may have to refresh that Boveda pack, replace it with a new one if it gets hard. So that's how you keep it hydrated properly. And then I've already talked about, don't store it with apple slices or bread, or even don't try and drip a little bit of water on it and then seal it up. Don't steam it to try and make it more moist. It does take time to rehydrate it with those humidity packs, and otherwise you're just going to encourage mold, and you're going to waste a lot of your product and money and time as well with that. Indefinitely, under the right conditions, I've known people who've pulled product out of their cupboard. They've gone to move after living in a house for 20 years, and they use that product, that dry herb product, and it still worked perfectly fine. As we learned when we talked about the cannabinoids in an earlier lesson, CBN, THC will degrade into CBN, that cannabinoid that is very sedative. So even if you find that you're not getting, if you want to use your product recreationally and you're not getting the psychoactivity from it that you were looking for, it might make you very sleepy, so there's not necessarily a reason to throw that out. But always, look at old products, make sure it hasn't been infested with bugs, it doesn't have any mold or anything like that growing on it, it hasn't been contaminated in any way. If it turns to dust when you crumble it, there's really no way that you're going to be able to rehydrate that properly. Once it's kind of dusty, dry, it's not going to rehydrate properly. You can discard it. I know some people who kind of save up those little dusty bits, and they might use that to make an edible product with. So again, you can either discard it, or you can kind of save it up until you have enough, and you can add that to your, if you're making some butter for edibles, those kinds of things, you can still use that. And then we already talked about how THC will degrade into CBN, which is very sedative, has sedative properties to it. So doesn't necessarily need to be thrown out. You can just repurpose it as a sleep aid. So storing our ingestible oils, we already talked about this a little bit. Keep that in both an airtight and leak-proof container. It should be shipped to you in a leak-proof container that doesn't have, or that does have a child-proof lid on it. Keep that at room temperature, because at colder temperatures that oil could turn solid, and then it makes it really hard to actually dose. You can't get it into the dropper. Around 18 months to 2 years is what the licensed producers are suggesting it lasts long for. But again, like other cannabis products, there's no expiry date, there's no best before date on there at this point in time in August 2020. When we're doing this, that may change as we get more information. We have a little more length of time that we've been studying this product, that people have had these products in different conditions in their house. So it may change over time. Discard the oil if it has a rancid smell to it, or it might just taste off. You might want to throw it out at that point. If the dropper, when you're using that dropper, if it touches your tongue or your mouth or your lips, there's potential for contamination that it will pick up from your mouth. That contamination will be taken by the dropper back into the product, and then you have the potential for bacteria or fungus or mold or something that grows in that container. Sometimes molds that grow in food products or fungus that grow in food products, they have no odor to them and they have no taste to them, but they can be quite deadly. So again, be very careful with your dropper, hygiene with your dropper. If by chance you accidentally touch your tongue with it, then make sure that you take that dropper apart, wash it really well with some soap and hot water, and then make sure it's thoroughly dried for at least 24 hours before you use that product back, or that dropper back into your product. Because on the reverse side, if there's a little bit of water left in your dropper and you put that back into your container, that water could encourage the development of mold and mildew and other bacterial growth within the product. So again, just good common sense about when how we're handling these products. Keep them safe. Edible products follow proper food storage techniques. You know, if you've made some cookies, treat them the way you would treat any other cookies, you know, airtight container. If they're really moist, then you want to keep them in a cooler area of the house, or you want to keep that container open a little bit so that they don't get too moist and mold in there. Always, 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 your homemade cannabis goodies need to be kept in a childproof container, or at least out of reach, out of sight of a child, and labeled. Put a big label on there that says, caution, these brownies, they look delicious, but they contain THC. Do not touch, these are, product just for medical use. So again, be very careful with the storage of edible products, and probably the most important thing there is the labeling of them, so that a roommate or a teenager or someone doesn't inadvertently come in and say like, hey, look at these delicious looking cookies here, and then eat 2 or 3 of them and then get themselves into a really uncomfortable position. Salves, creams, and suppositories, again, airtight, leak-proof containers. Make sure that they are well labeled. You want to keep those at room temperature or lower. Now, storing creams and salves in the fridge sounds like a great idea, except when you go to put them on an area of your body and it's really cold when you put it on there, so it can be uncomfortable until that comes to body temperature. But on the reverse side, if we keep some of those products at room temperature, especially in the summer months, and room temperature might be actually quite warm, those products are in danger of like breaking down, separating, melting. Like in the case of suppositories, they might melt, and then you don't have the shape there to help insert them properly. So again, keep them away from heat sources, keep them away from direct sunlight, keep them in a cool place. And again, discard if it's rancid or that off smell, or if it breaks down, you see some watery areas within that product when you open up, if it bubbles, if you find that the oils start to separate out and the product looks like it's layered instead of a nice, consistent, homogenized product. Those are important. I found some people with the suppositories is that they actually prefer to be kept in the fridge because they find that a little bit more comfortable with insertion. So again, that would be personal preference, but definitely with suppositories, because they're designed to melt or to dissolve, to break down at body temperature. And so if your room temperature is above body temperature, then you're going to have some melted products on your hand. Liquid vape cartridges, we always want to keep these in their original container, their original vial, in their childproof packaging until it's time to use them. Make sure that you don't just leave your vape pen sitting around on the coffee table or a kitchen table, you know, where it's very handy for you to use. But if there's young children running around, they like to mimic what adults do, and so they could inadvertently use that product, and we'd get ourselves into an uncomfortable situation with those. Keep them at room temperature, again, away from sources of heat, shield from direct sunlight, and properly dispose of these as well. Some of them are recyclable, most of them are not recyclable, and if you find that you have a product that still has some oil in there, vape oil in there, that is a higher THC concentration, and you don't like it, you're going to throw that product out. Dispose of that in a responsible way, in the same way that you would dispose of pharmaceutical drugs. And the best way to do that is just to take that used or partially used product that you're no longer going to use, take it down to the pharmacist, and they have ways of safely disposing of products that way. So that's a little bit of information about product care. Of course, the most important thing is childproof containers out of reach of children, pets, adults, and make sure everything is well labeled if they're homemade products.